Welcome to SalonEra, a salon experience for the 21st century that brings together artists and audiences for music and conversation. Produced remotely, SalonEra is not subject to geographic or conventional programming and limitations, and that means that every episode is full of different artists, different music, and spontaneous conversation. We're creating new opportunities for artists to collaborate, and we're bringing our work and our passions directly into your home. We'd love to see and feel your encouragement or applause, so feel free to engage in the chat at any time. We also look forward to responding to your thoughts and questions when we go live for the post-show Q&A. While SalonEra is free to watch, I urge you to consider making a donation. Your support compensates our participating artists whose livelihoods have been so dramatically affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. You can even show your support with a $75 gift that's akin to subscribing to the series. Thanks for watching and enjoy the show. This episode really revolves around three women, myself, Daphna Mor, and Elizabeth Weinfield, exploring our Jewish heritage and identity in early music from different perspectives. Jewish history is filled with persecution and migration, and this was a lived experience in my own family. My grandparents escaped Central Europe during the Holocaust, arriving first in Antwerp, Belgium, before moving to London, where my father was born in 1940. I was frequently reminded of how religious persecution had decimated our once extended family, and how my own parents' immigration to the United States separated us from the little family that we had left. In the 21st century in the United States, I have the privilege of identifying as culturally Jewish, though I am not observant. In 17th century Antwerp, however, it was illegal to live openly as a Jew. Religious intolerance affecting both Jews and Muslims gained frightening momentum in the late 15th century as the Spanish and then the Portuguese Inquisitions spurred the migration of tens of thousands. They moved south to Morocco, east to Italy, Egypt, and Turkey, as well as north to the Low Countries and England, establishing diasporic communities. Converting to Catholicism and living outwardly as a Christian offered little reprieve from persecution. Those newly converted Christians, known as conversos, were met with deep suspicion and thus continued to endure anti-Semitism while living in established ghettos, often in commercial centers like London or Antwerp. Tonight, our guest Elizabeth Weinfield will introduce us to Leonora Duarte. There are so many things that make Duarte remarkable and fascinating. She was a converso whose family settled in Antwerp in 1571 to become both patrons and practitioners in the arts. They collected and commissioned paintings by the likes of Vermeer, Rubens, Titian, and others, while also performing, composing, and maintaining relationships with an international cadre of musicians. Leaving their artistic endeavors aside for a moment, Duarte's family settled in Antwerp primarily for business, the jewelry business. In fact, the strong presence of Jews in the diamond industry dates back to the 16th and 17th centuries, when diamonds were still a relatively rare and new commodity, and diamond trade routes linked Jewish centers in the diaspora. Perhaps most important for a community lacking full legal rights or protections, the fact that there was no guild for diamond cutting made it possible for Jews to work in this industry. We'll talk more with Elizabeth about Leonora Duarte, her music, and the challenges of defining Jewish identity in a time and place when it was illegal to publicly observe. We'll also talk in this episode with Israeli multi-instrumentalist and singer Daphna Mor. Daphna is a virtuoso recorder player whose formative training was rooted in the Western classical tradition. As an adult, however, her integration of classical Arabic music, collaborations with Moroccan musicians, and performances of Jewish liturgical music have transformed and enriched her identity as an artist, teacher, and communicator. Sharing heartfelt performances along the way, Daphna will speak to the importance of oral tradition in preserving the songs, languages, prayers, stories, and tunes from multiple traditions that extend far beyond Ashkenaz or Sephardi. Daphna Mor joins us tonight from her home in Brooklyn, New York, and Elizabeth Weinfield is on New York's Upper West Side. Welcome. Good evening, Elizabeth. It is so great to see you here.
Hi, Debra. It's just a delight to see you, particularly in this context.
Thank you. I know you've done actually years of work on Leonora Duarte, both as a scholar and as a performer, and I was wondering how you first came to be introduced to her and her music.
Well, I first learned about Duarte by sight reading some of her music. It is published, but as a scholar, I've looked at the manuscript a little bit. The manuscript is in the Christ Church College Library at Oxford University. The Duarte family were very connected with England through their business as jewel dealers, ultimately dealing in jewels to the English royal family. But they also had a lot of musical connections in England. So there are a lot of possibilities for how the manuscript winds up at Oxford. But what's special about the manuscript is that we think that the titles of the works were copied by Leonora's father, Gaspar, just due to handwriting matching. So we can date them from around 1625 through 1653, which is the year of Gaspar's death. There's such a variety of style in the works. There are 7 extant sinfonia. This is the extant repertoire of Leonora Duarte, but all 7 of them are in 5 parts, and they favor a very high tessitura. We choose to play them with 2 violins on the top. We recorded all of them using violins on the Centaur label.
And where do we imagine that these were heard?
They were undoubtedly heard in the Duarte home, and possibly in the home of William and Margaret Cavendish, who were English royalists in exile in Antwerp, as so many royalists were. These really are very intimate pieces, though, and they're really meant for the domestic space. They really become a kind of sonorous part of the Kunstkammer, of the collector's cabinet.
Well, we're going to hear another piece, number 5 out of 7 of these sinfonias, with your ensemble, Sonambula. And I wondered if you could introduce this piece for us, and also to let us know what for you makes it stand out among, or makes it unique among the 7.
This was the first piece of Duarte's that I heard. I was completely struck by it. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard or played, and at that point I'd played through a lot of the concert repertoire, particularly the English concert repertoire. But aside from the fact that it was just really good music, it intrigued me for 2 sort of particular reasons. One was that it was written by a woman with a complicated Jewish identity. So there was some personal resonance there. But the other point of interest was how the work's construction gave voice to my instrument.
Right.
I was playing the altus part, so the very middle of 5 voices. And it's a part that at many moments in the work sort of lends itself to leading quietly from the background, which is so much sort of an experience of being a woman in the world in some ways. It really seems to take the lead, altering harmony. It begins phrases, it initiates texture changes, and it sort of carves and guides the shape of the piece from within. And it reminded me of what the philosopher Anne du Formentel might call a politics of gentleness. The goal of approaching the most complex subjects shouldn't be to define them, shouldn't be to conscribe them to meaning, but rather should be to carve out evidence around them, to let their voice come through. And sometimes, frankly, the best way to do that is in performance.
Elizabeth, that is so beautiful and moving. There's a real contemplative quality. I totally hear the gentleness. It's kind of a little bit pleading in its insistence.
Yes, there is something pleading or mourning about
Absolutely.
it.
It's hard when you hear something like that not to try to imagine or visualize or somehow contextualize the person responsible for bringing that music into the world. And the question that I have is, again, one about identity and how you see Duarte as a composer, and is she a Jewish composer, and how is identity complicated for her?
It's a great question. There are lots of points of entry into a larger and really much more complex discussion, Deborah, as you're alluding to, of Jewishness and race, really, that inevitably underlies, or at least should underlie, any study of Duarte, who's a converso, meaning, in this context, a converted Catholic. And maybe I should clarify some terminology. Converso refers to, in this context, in the 17th century, talking about the exodus from the Iberian Peninsula, so Spain and Portugal. It refers to a Jewish person who converted to Catholicism, either by force, mass conversion usually, or by choice. Crypto-Jew refers to someone who has converted but who is secretly practicing Judaism at home to sort of keep up their tradition, to keep up their religion, but on paper they are Catholic. So, but Deborah, back to your question. As a converso, as a converted Catholic, is Duarte, after all, a Jewish composer?
Right.
So if we define Jewish composer in the early modern period as someone who's writing music, let's say, for the synagogue, then the answer is obviously no. She wasn't writing music for the synagogue. And one composer, though, with whom Duarte is so often compared is Salomone Rossi, the other Jewish composer of the late Renaissance, early Baroque period, writing both secular and sacred music. But Duarte wasn't writing for the synagogue for two reasons. One, she was a woman. And secondly, Deborah, as you mentioned in the introduction, her Jewishness was illegal in her home city and, in fact, throughout her lifetime. So as intriguing as these allusions to Rossi and to Lupo are, they may actually serve to sort of reveal, I should say, a kind of circumscribed understanding of Jewishness in the musical realm. But if we look at Duarte's very complicated and in many ways unidentifiable or unknowable relationship to Judaism, we see that it doesn't fit into the same category that music history has sort of carved out for Rossi. Interestingly, Duarte's mother, Caterina Rodriguez, appears to have avoided baptism. So according to Jewish law, this meant that her children would be recognized as Jews. So from the contemporaneous Christian viewpoint, this would have rendered the whole family largely suspect. But there was a certain anti-Judaic, let's call it, racism that was felt even toward conversos in the 17th century. The conversos were sort of neither Catholic or Jewish. They were living in a kind of bifurcated exile, I want to call it.
Right. So what is the difference here between race and ethnicity?
So we would refer to Duarte as ethnically Jewish. So race is much more of a social term. Race is a social construct. Ethnicity refers to one's heritage. So the converso in Antwerp were thought of as ethnically Jewish. They were categorized as a race of people, but in accordance to their ethnic background, and so therefore they're figuratively ghettoized. It's tempting to wonder, what were Duarte's thoughts about music, identity, religion, ethnicity? And I certainly wonder this all the time. And this is the lure of history. This is the lure of performing music and wondering what's going on in their head as they're writing this. But we can't ever know. And attempting to answer this is not our goal as a historian, at least. But what I can show as a historian or as a performer is that she exists within a rich nexus of diverse influences and amidst a very complicated landscape in 17th century Antwerp. This is a city that had banned the practice of Judaism and in which Judeo-Portuguese immigrants like Duarte and her family were forced to live as Christians. And so we have this environment in which we have a deeply ingrained culture of anti-Semitism that positions conversion and blending and passing as normative. So is Duarte a Jewish composer? I would say that her Jewishness exists and lives on through her music and the bodies that perform it, insofar as her work is a legacy of her complex history.
I wanted to anticipate, though, the next piece that we're going to hear, which is a fantasia by the viol player Thomas Lupo.
We know from some letters that Leonora's father borrowed a number of books from a friend of theirs, Constantine Hauchens, who is one of the most important figures in early modern diplomacy. He's a very close colleague and friend of the family's. The Duartes borrowed a number of music books from him. In particular, one which was published in Amsterdam in 1648, which is known as the Koninklijke Fantasieën, which contains three-part music by Giovanni Caprario, by Orlando Gibbons, by William Damon, and by Thomas Lupo. So we know that the Duartes were playing Lupo, and actually further letters tell us that they not just borrowed those books, but they copied extensively from those books. So possibly Duarte not just played Lupo, but studied him as a student of composition herself. So she would have known Lupo as a composer of music for instruments that she likely played herself. But they also knew about other Jews. They were educated people. They knew about Jews exiled, non-exiled in their own day. They knew about Spinoza, for example. So it's very likely that they would have known about Lupo's ethnic origins as one connected to current affairs would. But again, I think we have to be very careful of not trying to sort of locate Jewishness in Lupo, particularly as a kind of foil for a sort of unity in exile with Duarte. But what the existence of Lupo's music does tell us, and Duarte's music for that matter, is that Jews and all kinds of ethnically Jewish people played music in the early modern period. And if we're lucky enough to look at those composers side by side in a critical context, as we are thanks to you, Debra, what emerges really is how diverse the Jewish story really is in the early modern period. And that's very significant.
And I love that actually there's literally a connection. You could imagine this Lupo that we're about to hear, being played or studied in the Duarte home. This is fantastic. So let us listen to some music by Thomas Lupo. hope you enjoyed the remote collaboration we just heard, which was created especially for this episode. While recording remotely presents some unique challenges, we're so happy to be able to bring artists together for new collaborations and to share their fascinating and beautiful work. In this way, SalonEra supports working artists who have all been deeply affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll return to the show in a moment, but in the meantime, please consider supporting these artists and SalonEra with a donation. Welcome, Daphna, and thank you so much for playing some beautiful lupo with me.
I'm so happy to be here, as you know. Hello, ladies.
Hello.
Well, I want to, take also a huge shift from the 17th century into something much closer to today. But both of the things that we're talking about have their origin in this great kind of migration as a result of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions. Daphna, you've taken a real personal journey with Sephardic music and embraced it in your life as a performer and learning as you go. But I wanted to talk first of all about the languages that we're going to hear. You're from Israel. Hebrew is your native language, but this next piece is in Ladino. So I wondered if you could tell us what Ladino is, what the origins of the language are, and where it's spoken today.
Sure. In direct relation to topics you've discussed already with Elizabeth and in your introduction, Ladino is a language that developed after the 1492 expulsions of the Jews from Spain, followed by 1497 from Portugal, so the Iberian Peninsula. In Spain, the Jews spoke some version of Judeo-Espanol language, and that is the umbrella name for the languages, the dialects that would come out of this in the different diasporas. So Judeo-Espanol, Jewish Spanish, in my family later was called as Spaniolit. It's also, you hear Judaismo, and then you have the word Ladino. And today we try to define Ladino as specifically the language that developed with the Jews who entered the Ottoman Empire. So in that you have in Ladino also incorporation of Turkish, some Hebrew, some of the Balkan languages. What we're going to hear next, which is Moses Salio de Misraim, is actually a specific dialect of that Romance language, the Judeo-Espanol, and it is called the Hakitia, which is the dialect that was spoken in North Africa. So the Jews, when they were expelled, moved also very close geographically into North Africa. And what is beautiful is that Moses Salio, this specific romanza, it is a romanza, it's a specific form of song, is only found in Morocco. Also does have, or believed to have, direct connection from pre-1492 in its form as in literature and the melody.
Wow. So I understand how difficult it can be actually to date Sephardic melodies. And it is interesting that you tell us how unique Moses Salio is, because we can actually share a field recording from the 1950s.
Yes, this specific recording was recorded by ethnomusicologist Henrietta Yochenko. I had the pleasure to work with her later in her life and to discuss this recording and also revive some of those Smithsonian recordings.
So we actually have a little clip to listen to, so let's hear that for a moment.
Moses salió de Misraim, huyendo del rey Paró, se fue derecho a Midian y se encontró con Yitro. Le dio así por a su hija, porque era temiente a Dios. Moses paseando el ganado que su suegro le entregó. Moses paseando el ganado al monte de Joret llegó. Viera y el zarzal no se quemó.
That is so beautiful, and I'm struck by several things. First of all, she's singing unaccompanied. There's this moment where you can almost hear a baby in the background.
Yes.
Oh, in
Yeah.
other of the songs, you can hear the babies, and sometimes you can hear also the cooking. You hear the pots and pans. It was really recorded in their homes, and these songs. This is a song. It's a romanza. Would be that kind of song that would be sung at home.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I'm struck also by the ornamentation. Very subtle, very beautiful.
I know.
And so this is quite different from what we're about to hear in your performance with your group east of the river. And so I wondered if you could just prepare us for what we're going to hear.
Actually, I've learned this song in liturgical context. I was a musician in residency for many years at B'nai Jeshurun in the Upper West Side, a big synagogue in New York City, where we worked on Piyut team, which we'll discuss later, and liturgical songs, bringing them into the liturgical setting. And this is where I learned this song before I met actually Henrietta, with the rabbis there who are originally from Argentina, speaking Spanish, speaking Ladino, and I learned this song. And then we recorded that for a recording for the synagogue. Later, when Nina Stern, my close friend and colleague and co-director of East of the River, and I were starting to think of some programs, I brought this song. So I already had some kind of ideas of what I wanted to do with it. Our ensemble combines instruments from Western Europe, the recorders prominently, and some Eastern instruments like the oud. This performance, we were invited by WQXR, WNYC, to perform a Hanukkah program. And so what will you hear is a version of myself singing it based on the way we've done it in the synagogue, and attached also the way we did in the synagogue to an instrumental interlude. Very, very common practice in Eastern traditions to put instrumental interludes in between verses that are new composed or taken from other sources. Here we're taking it from an ensemble called Radio Tarifa, which is a Spanish ensemble. And then after that, Nina and I felt the need to create even an extra instrumental material. And we were on tour, we were in a hotel room, and we're like, let's write a rota style ending for this, taking based on Lamento de Tristano rota, which is a medieval piece, medieval Western European. And we said, let's create with some material from Moses Salio a rota for East of the River. So you hear three different elements to this performance.
Dio le si corra su hija, por le que era temiente de Dios, pues se pasaba el ganado, so sus vergo le entregó.
beautiful and
music.
so fun. Yes. Thank you so much,
Thank
Daphna. We talked with Elizabeth a few moments ago relative to Leonora Duarte about Jewish identity.
Right.
And you alluded to it a little bit in talking about your role at B'nai Jeshurun, but the way that your identity has evolved as an artist, and also incorporating Jewish liturgical music into your performance life. And so I was wondering how that's evolved for you over time.
I grew up in Israel so my first Jewish identity was more cultural identity, part of being a secular Israeli. There was the idea of creating a new Jewish identity. So actually a lot of your background was put by the family itself as a secondary important element. In the same way we're talking about the language Ladino. Ladino was a spoken language in my house, but we were never taught this. Same thing as the Yiddish. I'm half Sephardic and half Ashkenazi. So my first identity was as Israeli, and also with looking into Western Europe in terms of culture. That's my education as a musician. My grandmother, that's the music that she would take me to listen. That's the music that I used to listen to and made. It is later, I think actually after I left Israel, I moved to Boston and then to New York, where things started to come together. And through also my work at the synagogue with B'nai Jeshurun, my love for Ladino and for Sephardic music has deepened. I've always had, even as a secular person, an affinity to liturgy and to ceremonial elements of my culture. Again, not in the traditional way of being an observer or a believer, but more of how it connects me to people and to my past, to history. And I love Hebrew as a deep language, and a lot of the prayers, a lot of the poetry is in beautiful Hebrew. So I always connected to just the depth of the language and the metaphors, and also the melodies.
When did you get involved with Piyut?
So just to define it again for our audience, what is Piyut? The word Piyut refers to Jewish liturgical poems that are sung, recited, or chanted. The poetry is so beautiful. It started already from the 1st to the 6th century in Israel, and then continued later to in the diaspora, and was actually very, very prominent in Spain in the time that the Jews lived there. And so we have this great poets of Spanish period, Sepharad. I started to really research it and participate as a I wouldn't call it performer because it was in liturgical settings, as a musician and as a researcher while working at the B'nai Jeshurun under the umbrella of this organization called Piyut North America, which has a connection to Piyut, Hazmana LePiyut, which is the organization in Israel. And when I was telling you, there is a renaissance of Piyutim and using Piyutim now outside of their context, in concerts, in evenings of culture, that is thriving in Israel. There's also a lot of new melodies written to these ancient Piyutim. So it is a really a live culture.
Cool. We are going to hear a Piyut Achot Ketana, which is for Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. And it has a great message for us all, actually, as we approach a milestone in the pandemic. And I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about the origins of this performance and anything that we should know or be listening for in Achot Ketana.
Sure. Achot Ketana is a really intimate piyut. The poetry is a very personal connection of the poet and divinity. And there is a beautiful repeated line that you would hear, which is Tichle Shana V'Kilelepeha, which is may this year and its curses end. And then there are the verses, and at the end, the poet adds the message of hope, and may a new year and its blessings begin. So I have goosebumps as I'm telling you this because you and I have spoken about it. It is such a relevant message and relevant prayer for optimism, and also again connects us to generation past. People have gone through other times that were difficult and had to find the strength for hope. What you should listen to, and we had it also in Musicalio, which I would think that would be an interesting element, is the improvisational element. We have the simple Piyut, but you'll see the creativity of the musicians, and especially you'll hear beautiful solo violin by Elim Basal, the Turkish violinist.
Wonderful. Let's listen to that.
Thank you.
Hi, Daphna, that is so beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned a few moments ago about your work with Piyut North America, and you referenced also the kind of the mother organization in Israel, but in fact, it's encompassing traditions from the Jewish diaspora all around the world.
Absolutely.
And, it's something that you've brought not only into your performance, but also into your work as an educator, literally around the world. And I'm wondering where you have taught and shared this music, and if there was a particularly meaningful moment of cultural exchange in the course of that.
So we've spoken mostly about the Sephardic tradition today. We refer to the Ashkenazi tradition, but we have so many other traditions in Piyut in general. We also explore music from the Mizrahi, from Yemenite, from Iraqi, from India. So basically wherever Jewish presence has been, people are using the same texts. A lot of them are ancient texts, but the melodies are very, very specific to the group of people. So one of my most exciting collaboration is with Moroccan singer and musician, Muslim Moroccan musician, Rashid Halihal, where we do music that is Moroccan music, bringing the Arabic words and the Jewish piyutim and prayers that the Moroccan Jewish community put into those melodies. So I love that exchange. One of the most exciting experiences that I had was to be invited to give a Piyut workshop for the Jewish people of Mumbai at the JCC there. And again, we have these common texts as the beginning, as the opening. They know the same texts that other Piyutim have been composed to. So I went there and they taught me their melodies for the same poetry, and which I've brought with me back to my community, Beinenu, and in general in performance. So I now do a lot of their work, of their melodies, and I brought them other melodies, including American melodies, Yemenite, Iraqi melodies, Sephardic melodies, and we had this beautiful exchange.
Wow, we actually have a little clip, video, which I understand was taken during that workshop in Mumbai that I'd love to share. Amazing that you could go to the other side of the world and learn and have this cultural exchange. And I have to admit that you shared your music with me and with us for this episode, which is to say that our final collaboration tonight is a piyut on In Kelohenu, which is a prayer that I knew growing up, and I can hear the sound of my mother's voice in my head singing it to a totally different tune than the one that you shared with me. And the interesting thing for me in exploring the music with both you and Elizabeth and these questions of identity through the course of preparing this episode, in my synagogue growing up as a conservative tradition, there was just the chanting, which I didn't at that time really totally understand as music. I just understood it as intoned prayer. And there were no instruments and, just maybe organ on the high holy days. And as a result, I never personally felt like I was involved in Jewish music until this piyut that you shared with me. We're going to hear in a few moments In Kelohenu, and I wondered if you could just tell us where this prayer is from and when it's sung or heard. And it's not the melody that I grew up with, so I'm wondering where this one is from as well.
Right. So In Kelohenu, there is no one like our God, is a very short poem that goes, it has a flow. There is none talking about God as God, Lord, King, and Savior. And the text is anonymous. There's proof that it's before the 9th century, because there is a text referencing this Piyut that is from the 9th century. So it's a very old text. It is sung in Hebrew in most communities, and in Ladino communities, it is also translated to Ladino as well. So you hear the Hebrew and you hear the Ladino. People who speak Spanish or know some Spanish would recognize the text. It is sung usually at the end of the service on Shabbat morning or during the day, the weekdays. But it usually has a very light and energetic feeling to it in most of the melodies that I know, because people have been in synagogue. They've heard the Torah recited. They need something to bring it up. So the American version that I learned is like, Ein Keloheinu, Ein Kadonenu,
Ein Kmoshienu. Yes.
Yes, exactly. And there is a one from Belgrade, which is Non como nuestro Dios, mi Eloheinu. So you'll see that there is usually like, let's wake up the community, and get excited towards the end. This one is so delicate and so gentle. It also comes from the Moroccan tradition, and it's really just very unique because it is kind of like a lullaby in a way. And I can't tell you how excited I am about what we've done together to create this, because for me it is this beautiful, perfect marriage of my two lives that I usually used to not put together. And it has been such a joy to work on it with you.
Thank you. Well, it was a real joy for me, and I'm so grateful that you shared this with me and also the rest of my colleagues, including our associate producer, Shelby Yaman, who plays violin here. I look forward to talking with you more about this, and also with Elizabeth when we go live for the Q&A in a few minutes. And in the meantime, let's enjoy this new made for the moment Ein Keloheinu that you've shared with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Non
We will be back in a few moments with Elizabeth and Daphna for our live Q&A. And if you are watching on SalonEra.org, you can simply press the refresh in your browser and the Q&A should reload. If you are watching on Facebook or on YouTube, I suggest subscribing or liking our page and you'll get an instant notification that we are going live. In the meantime, we are previewing two upcoming programs, both of which celebrate Women's History Month. Leda Lisa's virtual concert, Women of Genius, is premiering on March 18th. And our next episode of Salon Era, if all of these wonderful women, this episode were not enough, focuses on women in music up on March 15th. We'll see you at the Q&A in just a moment. There's a lot to look forward to as Leda Lisa's virtual concert series, Embracing Change, continues. In March, we honor Women's History Month by celebrating the contributions of remarkably accomplished, creative women in 17th and 18th century France. Soprano Clara Rotzal joins us for this program, highlighting women composers and strong female characters with works by Julie Pinel, Elizabeth Jacquet de la Guerre, and others. With Embracing Change, Leda Lisa is venturing into uncharted territory and taking creative risks head on. Join us on the journey. Tune in on March 15 as we celebrate Women's History Month with a special episode featuring instrumental and vocal music by Maddalena Sirman, Barbara Strozzi, Isabella Leonarda, Elizabeth Jacquet de la Guerre, and Clara Schumann. Featured guests include harpsichordist Byron Schenkman, violinist Shelby Yaman, and soprano Michelle Kennedy, who share a commitment to researching, performing, and recording music by women composers.